Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here, to be at the Green Festival, and I want to congratulate the Green Festival because, well, not only for the magnificent weather today, we know the powers of the Green Festival, but just for all of you coming out and deeply believing that we have to create a sustainable world where we depend on each other and not on oil. We, as we travel, doing the first book, Exception to the Rulers, in 2004, which, by the way, should be the motto of all of the media, right? The exception to the rulers. It should not only be the motto of Democracy Now! And the second book, Static, and we called it that because, well, in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, all we get is ever more static, that veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need is the dictionary definition of static. That's what we need the media to give us: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And it matters. It matters when the media tells the truth. We know what happens when it doesn't. We know what happened in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. It's hard to believe it was more than 5 years ago. The U.S. has been involved in Iraq longer than the U.S. was involved in World War II. In that lead up to the invasion, the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts right around Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, giving that push for war at the UN, which he now calls a stain on his career. The 4 major nightly newscasts: ABC, World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, and PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Of those 4 major nightly newscasts in the 2-week period and the critical month before the invasion, when the media is, as Noam Chomsky says, manufacturing consent, right? Manufacturing consent for war. There were 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? 0 is an underestimate. 4 is an overestimate. 3. There is a good listener to Democracy Now! 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That is an extremist media beating the drums for war, because those who are opposed to war, those who are opposed to torture, are not a fringe minority in this country, not a silent majority either. But the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, and we have to take it back. It matters. The media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, than any missile, and the Pentagon's deployed the media. It's not good for the generals. It's not good for the low-level soldiers. It's not good for a democratic society. We need an unembedded media. Reporters embedded in the front lines of troops do not give us even a portion of the story. What about embedded in Iraqi hospitals and communities in the peace movement around the world? When the media acts as a conveyor belt for the lies, and I won't just say of the administration, because yes, the Democrats enabled the Republicans in this. It couldn't have happened if they hadn't voted with the Republicans to authorize war. We need to see the images of war. It's the only way to stop it. And hear these young people speaking out. There are so many. I can't think of a more important reason for independent media than the Winter Soldier hearings that took place in Maryland, in Silver Spring, just outside the Beltway at the National Labor College. How many of you saw it or heard them on Democracy Now? We did it for 4 days. We got there early. We thought the rest of the media would crowd in. This is the moment that they all wait for, that you look for years. Someone who's closest to the story, a soldier with documentary evidence, videotape, and photographs telling their story, actually talking about atrocities that they're involved with. And they're all gathered in one place. Hundreds of vets from Iraq and Afghanistan and active duty soldiers, and none of the media came. Except the independent media, Pacifica Radio and Democracy Now! And Free Speech TV. That's why it's so essential we have independent media. The name Winter Soldier comes from a similar event in 1971, when hundreds of Vietnam vets gathered in Detroit, crowded into a Howard Johnson's. It's derived from the opening line of Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet published in 1776 called The Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman, he wrote. This Winter Soldier, organized by Iraq Veterans Against the War. Kelly Doherty, the group's executive director, opened the proceedings saying the voices of veterans and service members as well as civilians on the ground need to be heard by the American people, by the people of the world, also by other people in the military and other vets so they can find their voice to tell their story. Because each of our individual stories is crucially important and needs to be heard if people are to understand the reality and true human cost of war and occupation. The true cost. You know Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel economist, and Linda Bilmes, the Harvard economist, their new book, $3 Trillion War. $3 trillion. Some of that money being spent in Iraq, make no mistake about it, not for Iraq. And a large portion will be the cost of taking care of these wounded warriors coming home. $3 trillion. What followed was 4 days of horrific, gripping, painful testimony, ranging from first-hand accounts of murder of Iraqi civilians, the dehumanization of Iraqis and Afghanis, to the toll the violence takes on the soldiers themselves. You know, 1 million soldiers have served now in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's estimated a third are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder when they come back. A third. Think of the ripple effect of the violence in their families and the communities in this country. Over 4,000 soldiers are dead. Over 1 million Iraqis, it's believed, according to a Johns Hopkins Columbia University study. Over 1 million Iraqis, over 4,000 U.S. soldiers. Now, many soldiers testified, and then there was Joyce and Kevin Lucy. They came to talk about their son, Jeffrey, not included in the casualty numbers. Jeffrey was a Marine, served in 2003. Came back from Iraq. The family was so excited. He was living at home, be with his sisters, his parents, his girlfriend, go to college, resume his life, except he couldn't. He was falling apart, couldn't go to college. He was drinking heavily. They appealed to the VA. They said he had to dry out first. They said, that's the problem, and he didn't have this problem before. Please help us. They didn't understand post-traumatic stress disorder. They lived in Western Massachusetts. His grandfather took him physically to the VA and said, please take my grandson. This went on over a year. They didn't. And then in June of 2004, Jeffrey asked his dad, Kevin, if he could crawl into his lap. And his father rocked him silently for 45 minutes. At this point, he had been walking around in full military regalia looking for any weapon he could find, I mean, even a BB gun. And his father rocked him. And the next morning, his dad went off to work. His dad came home that night. He called for Jeffrey. There was no answer. He saw the basement door open, went downstairs, and saw his son hanging. The last time he cradled his son was taking the noose from around his neck. There have been hundreds of suicides. They are not counted in the war dead. His parents, even through their pain, go everywhere they can to stop this epidemic of suicides, these young people, and not so young, dealing with the pain by destroying themselves. And then there was John Michael Turner, He fought with the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines. I met him in Vermont about a month before the hearings, or 2 months, at a human rights film festival. We were both going in to see The Valley of Elah. He was clearly in a lot of pain. He told me about Winter Soldier. And he said he's going to testify there. It would be his first time talking. One of the things he said, on April 18, 2006, I had my first confirmed kill. This man was innocent, he said. I don't know his name. I called him the Fat Man. He was walking back to his house. I shot him in front of his friend and his father. The first round didn't kill him. After I had hit him up here in the neck area, afterward he started screaming, looked right in my eyes. So I looked at my friend, who I was on post with, and I said, I can't let that happen. So I took another shot, took him out. He was then carried away by the rest of his family. It took 7 people to carry his body away. John went on, we were all congratulated after our first kills, and that was mine. My company commander personally congratulated me. This is the same individual, he said, who had stated that whoever gets their first kill by stabbing them to death will get a 4-day pass when we return from Iraq. Hart Vigis also spoke. Hart Vigis was with the 82nd Airborne, part of the Invasion Force, 2003. He described a house raid where they arrested the wrong men. Hart said, we never went on a raid where we got the right house, much less the right person, not once. He said, I looked at my sergeant, I was like, Sergeant, these aren't the men we're looking for. He told me, don't worry, I'm sure they would have done something anyways. And this mother all the while is crying in my face, trying to kiss my feet. And you know, I can't speak Arabic, but I can speak human. She was saying, please, why are you taking my sons? They've done nothing wrong. And Hart said, this made me feel very powerless. Here I am, 82nd Airborne Division, infantry, with Apache helicopters, Bradley fighting vehicles, armor, and my M4, and I was powerless. I was powerless to help this mother. Former Staff Sergeant Camilo Mejia also spoke. You know who he is. He's now chair of Iraq Veterans Against the War. He's the Florida Army National Guardsman, went to Iraq. When he came back for leave, he refused to return. He offered to testify before Congress. He wanted to tell them about the abuse before Abu Ghraib. His unit was in charge of prisoners, and he wanted to talk about what was happening. Instead, he was court-martialed and sentenced to a year in the brig, of which he served most of that time. You have to ask, if we lived in a just society, who would be behind bars and who would be free? One soldier spoke also, and he said they bagged this Iraqi guy, literally bagged him. They threw him in a truck, and the commander just decided, he said they knew that he was innocent, but they had him in this bag. And the commander took out a camera and said to this young soldier, take my picture with him. And something in this kid's upbringing, I don't know if it was his parents, his mom, his dad, his grandparents, he just said, I can't, he said to his commander. He said, I said, take my picture. He said, I can't, sir. And he was brought up on charges of insubordination for humiliating his commander in front of his unit. Back to Camilo Mejia. At the end of his own personal testimony, he talked about the demands of Iraq Veterans Against the War. He said, we have over 1 million Iraqi dead. We have over 5 million Iraqis displaced. We have close to 4,000 dead Americans. We have close to 60,000 injured. That's not even counting post-traumatic stress and all the other psychological and emotional scars our generation is bringing home with them. War is dehumanizing a whole new generation of this country and destroying the people in Iraq. In order for us to reclaim our humanity as a military and as a country, we demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all troops from Iraq, care and benefits for all veterans, and reparations for the Iraqi people so they can rebuild their own country on their own terms. As we enter the 6th year of war in Iraq, we should honor the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. We should honor the people of Iraq and Afghanistan simply by listening to them. That's why we need an independent media. And I can't believe what an amazing job our sign interpreters are doing right now. I'm trying to speak slowly, but it's not easy. In Standing Up to the Madness, we profile the soldiers who say no, like Aaron Watada, the first officer to say no to war, like Army medic Agustin Aguayo, who learns from his basic training he can't kill anyone. He applies for conscientious objector status. He is evaluated by an officer who says, this guy's the real deal. He recommends it, but he doesn't get it. He serves in Iraq for a year. He refuses to load his gun, even though he is in danger. And when he goes back to Germany to his base, to his wife and his two 11-year-old twin girls, they tell him he's redeploying to Iraq. The soldiers are there in his house saying he's got to get his things. He jumps out the window, goes AWOL. And ultimately, we interview him at Democracy Now! In Los Angeles the day before he turns himself into Fort Irwin, saying, it doesn't matter what happens to me, I just know I can't kill anyone. And last night we were joined by Liam Madden, a remarkable young man, active duty, who together with Jonathan Hutto started the Appeal for Redress, thinking, what can we do as active duty soldiers? And realized that there is this vehicle where active duty soldiers can appeal to Congress to bring the soldiers home. There are so many heroes in our midst. And then in another section of Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times, we profile a group of people you would not want to meet in a dark alley if you were hijacking someone's civil liberties. And they are the librarians of this country. How many of you are librarians? Okay. Well, this is for you, and you probably know the story, but this is the librarians of Connecticut. Who would have thunk it? But they have a computer system within the libraries that connects 27 of the library's computers called the Library Connection. George Christian was its executive director. And one day, there's a knock on the office's doors, and it's two FBI agents. They hand him an NSL. It's a national security letter. And in opening it, it's like being exposed to radioactivity. You are immediately gagged. You cannot say to either a colleague, friend, family that you have been served with this letter. And it's demanding information about patrons who have used the computer system at a certain time. George Christian read the letter. He looked up at the agents, and he said, this is unconstitutional. The agents looked at him pityingly, like a predator sizing up his prey. They gave him their card, and they said, you get back to us. Now, George Christian doesn't even know if he can call a lawyer, if that's against the law, or if he could wind up 5 years in jail. Here is this brave librarian who has said no, and as he closes the door, he sits down in a chair, and he crumples down and says, what am I going to do? And he thinks, if I am going to take on the entire US government, I need at least 3 other librarians. And so he calls the executive committee of the Library Connection. One of them is Peter Chase. Peter Chase is the head of the Plainville Library. We went to visit him in Connecticut. And he gets a call. It's very cryptic. It's from George Christian. He says, we have an emergency meeting of the Library Connection Board tomorrow morning. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and please show up on time. Peter Chase had joined the board a few weeks before. He had said he didn't have any time, and he said he didn't have any time, and they said, listen, we'll give you a fancy title, Vice President. It will be easy. Easy. And so Peter Chase is racing to this meeting. And he is thinking, what could possibly be an emergency? Did someone not return their books? Did someone misfile an adult book in the children's section? He races to the meeting. There's a lawyer. There's the 3 other librarians of the board. George Christian shows them the letter. They are then exposed. They are gagged. They can't speak about it. The lawyer leaves, says, this is way over my head, and they call in the ACLU, and they decide to sue the Attorney General and the U.S. government over the USA Patriot Act. These librarians fighting for your freedoms. Now, I see I just have a few minutes, and I have a lot more stories to tell, so I'm going to make this very fast. They take this to court, but they can't go into the Bridgeport court. they were quite surprised. They were told they had to go in another court, and there a security guard locked the 4 librarians into a storage closet. No one was more surprised than the security guard himself. He said, "I have never locked librarians in a storage closet," he said. But there was a closed-circuit TV where they could watch the proceedings of the other courtroom. They saw it from the vantage point looking over the shoulder of the judge. They saw the entire courtroom and were quite moved to see hundreds of librarians packed into the courtroom. They ultimately did not win this case. They were gagged all through this period, which was the critical period when the U.S. government, when the U.S. Congress was reconsidering the renewal of the USA Patriot Act. They would have been testifying before Congress, speaking everywhere, but they were gagged. They couldn't speak all through that time. The federal government made a mistake, as they often will, and they released the names of the librarians in the Library Connection in one of the court documents. The New York Times picked it up. They called Peter Chase, and he was thinking, he hung up the phone because he knew he couldn't talk, but he thought, this is so silly. Here, they've called us John Doe, Connecticut. We're not allowed to reveal ourselves, and the government has. He calls his lawyer, he says, "You're not going to believe this. The Times called because they saw this document." And the lawyer goes silent. He said, "That's not funny, Peter. You leave your home now, and you shouldn't go back. You can stay at different people's houses every night." So now these librarians are not only gagged and muzzled, but they are on the run. Ultimately, the USA Patriot Act was passed. It was renewed. And a few weeks later, as inexplicably as they were served with this letter, it was lifted. And they're the only 4 people in this country, over 150,000 people, and it's probably way more, have received national security letters, who can talk about having received it, until last week when the archive, Internet Archive, which archives everything in the world, all information, archive.org, Brewster Kahle, its head, announced that he too had gotten one, and he had sued the US government with the help of the Electronic Freedom Foundation and the ACLU. It is absolutely critical that we stand up together. People cannot do this alone, and we need a media that shows the movements that express how social change happens. We also profile the scientists, the global warming scientists. The leading scientist, Dr. James Hansen, we were just with him on Earth Day in Washington, D.C. He starts to say that the global warming is getting more extreme. 2005, the warmest year ever at that point. And instead of the US government saying global warming is a problem, they say Jim Hansen is a problem. They put a 24-year-old political minder on him who will decide what reporters and reports he puts out. His name was George Deutsch. His claim to fame, his resume, said that he was a 2004 intern in the war room of the Bush-Cheney re-election campaign. And the scientists fought back, and they testified before Congress. We are not joking around. We are talking about the fate of the Earth. And we have a government that is vacuuming the words global warming off of government websites. This is why the government must be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Why this year is the critical year. 2008, do not make any mistake about it. This is your year. You may not agree with the presidential candidates who were ultimately chosen, and then you have to vote for president. But if you don't agree with everything, that is still not a reason not to participate, especially at the grassroots level. Be involved with your school board, with your library board, with your state legislature, and soon you'll be finding candidates, perhaps yourselves, that you do agree with to the highest levels, but it matters. I interviewed a woman on globalization years ago, and at the end of the conversation, she was from Guyana. I was ushering her away to speak with a new group about US elections, and she said she will be a part of that conversation. I said, well, actually, no, because we're talking about the US elections, and our conversation is done. And she said, I will be a guest in this segment of the show. I said, why? You're from Guyana. This is the US elections. She said, because I believe everyone in the world should get to vote for President of the United States. And it is such a significant point. She doesn't get to vote, and you do. And it really matters this year. It's not only the future of your family and your community and your state and this country that's at stake. It is the whole world. It is that serious, because we are the most powerful country on earth, and that power rests on your shoulders. I'll end with 2 brief minutes. Being here in Chicago and being not so far from Detroit, from the home of Rosa Parks. I want to end where we begin. We not only talk about modern-day heroes, also the psychologists in this country who are taking on the largest association of psychologists in the world, the American Psychological Association, because they refuse to ban their members from participating in coercive interrogations. We talk about the kids at the Wilton High School in Connecticut who are performing a play on war, and their principal said, no, it's too controversial. And because of the censorship, they end up on the New York stage, what actors dream of all their lives, performing the voices of soldiers who have written letters home. But we also go back in time to the turning points, to the kids of Soweto in South Africa in 1976 rising up, to Dan Ellsberg, who sees the peace protesters outside, top Rand Company official, top security clearance, Pentagon official. He's got a vault behind him that's got thousands of pages of the secret U.S. history of involvement in Vietnam, and he's got the key. And he knows these pages can end the war in Vietnam. And facing the rest of his life in prison, he decides to open the vault and get those papers out, and they're published as the Pentagon Papers. But we start with Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, that remarkable woman. You might wonder why we start with her. Everyone knows the story, but no, the corporate media still gets it wrong. Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, sits down on the bus, and in so doing, she stands up not only for African Americans, but for all of us. Because if any of us is diminished, we are all diminished. She refuses to move to the back of the bus. That night, her friend, the activist, African-American woman, teacher, educator, Joanne Robinson, mimeographs 35,000 flyers calling for the Montgomery bus boycott. A few days later, December 5th, 55, Rosa Parks goes to court. Montgomery Improvement Association has its mass meeting. They choose as its leader to lead the Montgomery bus boycott a young minister who's just come into town. His name is Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helps to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, when Rosa Parks died several years ago, we raced to Washington for the memorial service before the funeral in Detroit. Thousands came out. The media told her story. They said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker, and that's where they got it wrong. She was a first-class troublemaker. Rosa Parks was the local secretary of the NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He was president. He came out of radical labor politics, had been challenging the racist laws for years, and she had trained at the Highlander Center, black and white together, working to most effectively strategize to change this country. She knew exactly what she was doing on that day. And to show how brave she was, and this is where we end in Chicago, just go back a few months in the summer of 1955 to Mamie Till Mobley, who sends her boy, Emmett Till, down to Money, Mississippi for the summer to be with family. And he's lynched, he's killed. He ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They said he, quote, wolf whistled at a white woman. This little boy is tortured and murdered. When his body was sent back up to Chicago, right here, his mother, Mamie Till, did something incredibly brave. She said she wanted the world to see what had happened to him. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands streamed by his coffin and saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications published the photos. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till Mobley had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw those images of war in Iraq? We saw the babies dead on the ground. We saw the women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs. We saw the soldiers dead and dying across our TV screens on every front page of every newspaper in this country for just 1 week. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy now.